The observation deck was empty when Ambassador Cale Vance walked in, and the silence told him everything he needed to know about what had happened here just minutes ago. He could still see the signs of panic everywhere, and they painted a picture of absolute terror that had swept through the room. Like a storm, a coffee cup lay shattered on the floor, its contents spreading in a dark pool across the white tiles. Someone had knocked over a chair so hard that it had bent the metal legs. There were scratch marks on the door where desperate fingers had clawed to escape, and in the corner, he could see a single shoe that someone had lost in their rush to flee. The other human diplomats had run, and Cale did not blame them for it. He had read the reports about the Nethery, and every single one of them ended the same way: madness, they said, and blindness, and screaming that would not stop until the doctors put you under. The Nethery were not like other aliens that humanity had met among the stars. They did not have bodies the way normal creatures did. They existed partly in this universe and partly in somewhere else, a place that human eyes were never meant to see. Looking at them was like trying to read a book written in a language that your brain could not process, and the effort of trying would break something inside your head. Every species in the galaxy knew this simple truth, and every species stayed far away from the Nethery because of it. But someone had to talk to them, and Cale had volunteered when no one else would. He stood in the center of the observation deck and waited, his hands clasped behind his back to hide the way they were shaking. The air grew cold, and he could feel static electricity making the hair on his arms stand up. A sound filled the room that was not really a sound at all, but more like the memory of a sound that had never been made. And then she appeared. Cale had thought he was ready, but nothing could have truly prepared him for what he saw as Iris materialized in front of him like a nightmare given form, but also like a dream that was too beautiful and too terrible to hold in your mind. Her body was made of angles that should not exist and colors that had no names in any human language. She shifted and changed constantly, folding in on herself and unfolding again in ways that made his eyes water and his stomach turn. Parts of her seemed to exist in multiple places at once, and other parts seemed to not exist at all until he looked directly at them. His brain screamed at him to look away, to close his eyes, to run like all the others had run. Pain exploded behind his eyes, like someone had driven a hot needle through his skull. He could feel blood beginning to drip from his nose, warm and wet against his upper lip. Every instinct he had was telling him that he was going to die if he kept looking, that his mind was going to shatter like glass. But Cale did not look away. He thought of his daughter Emma, and the memory gave him strength even as it broke his heart all over again. She had been only 7 years old when the sickness took her, and he had sat beside her hospital bed for 3 weeks as she slowly faded away. The doctors had told him to take breaks, to look after himself, to step outside when it got too hard. But he had refused because Emma needed him, and he would not let her face the darkness alone. He had held her hand and looked into her eyes until the very end, even when every part of him wanted to run away from the pain. If he could do that, he could do this. Zareth waited in silence, and Cale got the sense that she was curious about why he had not collapsed yet. Most beings broke within seconds of seeing a Nethery, and here he was still standing after nearly a minute. "You should not be conscious," Zareth said, and her voice was like wind blowing through a cave made of crystals. It echoed in strange ways and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your brain is not built to process what you are seeing, and yet you remain awake and aware." Cale wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his hand and forced himself to speak. "It hurts," he admitted, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. His voice came out rough and strained, like he had been screaming for hours. "It hurts more than anything I've ever felt in my life, and I want to close my eyes more than I have ever wanted anything." He paused and took a shaky breath before continuing. "But I have seen worse." Xyrith tilted what might have been her head. Though the motion happened in directions that should not have been possible. Impossible, she said. And there was something almost like surprise in her alien voice. There is nothing in the history of your species that compares to perceiving a Nethri in their true form. And many have tried to claim otherwise before their minds broke. Kale thought about how to explain it. And he realized that words might not be enough, but he tried anyway. Because trying was all he knew how to do. Pain is not just physical, he said slowly. There is a kind of pain that goes deeper than the body. That reaches into the soul and tears it apart. And I have felt that pain before. He thought of Emma again. Of her small hand growing cold in his. I watched my daughter die. And I held her gaze until the very end, because I refused to let her be alone in that moment. His voice cracked. But he kept going. Looking at you hurts my eyes and my brain and every part of my body, but it does not hurt my soul. And that is the only kind of pain that can truly break me. The silence stretched between them. Heavy and strange Xyrith's form shifted and changed. And Kale got the feeling that she was studying him in ways he could not understand. You are different, she finally said. Different from the others of your kind who came before. And different from all the other species who have tried to speak with us over the centuries. Kale managed to smile despite the pain that was pounding through his skull like a drum. Maybe I'm just too stubborn to know when to quit, he said. My wife tells me that all the time. And she is usually right about these things. Something changed in Xyrith then. A subtle shift in her impossible geometry that Kale could not have described, but could somehow feel. It was almost like the beginning of curiosity. Or maybe even respect. Why did you come here? She asked. Why did you volunteer for this when all the others of your species ran away in terror? Kale looked at her directly, ignoring the fresh wave of pain that the effort sent crashing through his brain. Because someone had to. He said simply, your people have been alone for 3,000 years. And every species in the galaxy runs away from you because they cannot handle what you are. He paused and wiped more blood from his nose. That seemed lonely to me. And I know what loneliness feels like. Xyrith was silent for a long moment. You are strange, she said at last, but you are also brave. And I have not met a brave one in a very long time. Kale nodded, accepting the compliment, even though the motion made his head throb. I would like to keep talking, he said, if you are willing to let me try. And for the first time in 3,000 years, a Nethri said, yes. The Galactic Concord had existed for 10,000 years. And in all that time, they had learned one absolute truth about the universe. The Nethri were not to be approached. This was not a suggestion or a guideline or a recommendation that could be ignored when convenient. It was carved into the founding documents of the Concord itself, written in the languages of 100 different species, repeated in every diplomatic training program across the galaxy. Stay away from the Nethri, the rule said, because contact with them leads only to madness and ruin. The Chancellor of the Concord was a being called Vorith, and he belonged to a species that looked like tall trees made of blue crystal. He had held his position for 200 years, and in all that time, he had never felt the kind of fear that he felt now. You must recall Ambassador Vance immediately, Vorith said through the quantum communication link. His crystalline body chimed with stress harmonics that betrayed his calm words. We have seen what happens when species try to make contact with the Nethri, and it never ends well. On the other end of the link, the human representative nodded but did not agree. Ambassador Vance has requested permission to continue his, she said. He believes he can establish meaningful communication with the Nethri delegation. He is wrong, Vorith replied, and his body chimed louder with agitation. 3,000 years ago, the Velith tried to send their greatest minds to speak with the Nethri, and every single one of them was reduced to a catatonic shell within minutes. He paused to let that sink in 2,000 years ago. The Moratti built special machines to protect their diplomats during Nethri contact. And the machines melted and the diplomats went insane. Anyway, another pause. 1,000 years ago, the Kenthari developed drugs that they thought would let them survive Nethri exposure. And those drugs worked for exactly 11 minutes before their ambassador started clawing out his own eyes. The human representative did not flinch at these stories. Ambassador Vance has already survived 3 meetings with the Nethri envoy, she said calmly. Each meeting lasted over an hour. And while he has experienced significant physical distress, his mental faculties remain intact. Vorath could not believe what he was hearing. That is impossible, he said. No organic being can withstand prolonged Nethri exposure without permanent psychological damage. And yet Ambassador Vance has done exactly that. The representative replied, he will continue his diplomatic efforts unless directly ordered to stop by Earth's government. And we have no intention of giving that order. The communication link went dead, and Vorath was left alone with his fear across the galaxy. Kale Vance prepared for his 4th meeting with Xyrath. The room they used was specially designed for Nethri contact, with reinforced walls and medical equipment standing by in case of emergency. Kale sat in a simple chair in the center of the room and waited for his guests to arrive. His head still ached from their last meeting 3 days ago, a constant dull pain that never quite went away anymore. The doctors had scanned his brain and found something strange. New neural pathways were forming in his head, connections that had not existed before at the same time. Other pathways were burning out and then regrowing in different patterns. Your brain is changing, the lead doctor had told him with wonder and concern in her voice. We have never seen anything like this before, and we do not know what it means for your long-term health. Kale had thanked her for the information and then asked when he could schedule his next meeting with Xyrath. The doctor had called him crazy, and maybe she was right, but Kale knew that what he was doing mattered, even if he could not fully explain why the air in the room grew cold. And Kale felt the familiar static electricity crawling across his skin. Xyrath appeared before him, her form even more complex than it had been in their previous meetings. It was almost like she was testing him, pushing harder to see if he would finally break. Pain exploded through his skull, and blood immediately began dripping from his nose. His vision blurred and then cleared, as his brain struggled to process what it was seeing. But he did not look away, and he did not close his eyes, and he did not run. You came back, Xyrath said, and there was something in her voice that might have been curiosity. I always will, Kale replied through gritted teeth. Unless you tell me to stop coming. Xyrath shifted and changed, her impossible geometry folding in ways that made Kale's stomach lurch. Why? She asked. Why do you keep returning when every meeting causes you so much pain? Because someone has to, Kale said, repeating what he had told her in their first meeting. And because I want to understand you. No species has ever wanted to understand us, Xyrath said. They only want to survive us. And most of them cannot even manage that. Kale wiped the blood from his nose and leaned forward in his chair. Tell me about your people, he said. Tell me what it is like to be a Nethri, to exist in the way that you exist, to see the universe the way that you see it. Xyrath was silent for a long moment, and Kale got the sense that no one had ever asked her that question before. We do not experience time the way you do, she finally said. For you, time is a river that flows in one direction, carrying you from the past to the future, whether you want to go or not. She paused, and her form rippled like the surface of a pond. For us, time is more like an ocean, and we can swim in any direction we choose, though some directions are harder than others. Kale tried to imagine what that would be like, and failed completely. That sounds beautiful, he said honestly. It is beautiful. Zareth agreed. But it also makes it very hard to connect with beings like you, who are trapped in the river and cannot see the ocean that surrounds them. Is that why contact with your people drives other species insane? Kale asked, because they cannot handle seeing the ocean. Partly, Zyra said. When you look at me, your brain is trying to process information that exists in dimensions you cannot normally perceive. And the effort of that processing causes damage. She shifted again. And Kale felt a fresh spike of pain. But it is also because we are simply too much for most minds to contain. And the ones that cannot expand simply break instead. Kale thought about that for a moment. But my mind is not breaking, he said slowly. The doctors say it is changing, but it is not breaking. No, Zyrith agreed. And there was wonder in her alien voice. Your mind is not breaking. And we do not understand why. She moved closer to him, and the pain increased, but Kale held his ground. You are the first being in 3,000 years who has looked at us and chosen to keep looking, she said. The first who has felt the pain and decided that the pain was worth enduring. I warned you that humans are stubborn, Kale said with a weak smile. You warned me. Zyrith agreed. But you did not warn me that humans are also brave and kind, and willing to suffer for the chance to make a connection. She paused, and something in her form softened just slightly. I have been alive for a very long time. Ambassador Vance, and I have been alone for most of it. And I have forgotten what it felt like to have someone who wanted to stay. Kale reached out his hand toward her without thinking about it. Then, let me stay, he said simply, and Zyrith, for the first time in millennia, felt something that might have been hope. 6 months had passed since Kale Vance first looked upon a Nethri and refused to turn away in that time. The galaxy had watched with growing disbelief as the impossible continued to happen. The human ambassador met with Zerith twice every week, and each meeting lasted longer than the one before. Their conversations grew deeper and more complex, covering topics that no other species had ever discussed with the Nethri, and through it all, Kale Vance remained sane. The news spread quickly through the galactic concord, passed from species to species like a story too. Strange to be believed, a human was talking to the Nethri. A human was surviving prolonged exposure to beings that had broken the minds of 1,000 diplomats before him. A human was doing what the greatest civilizations in the galaxy had failed to do for 3,000 years on Earth. Kale had become something of a celebrity. Though he did not enjoy the attention, reporters wanted to interview him about his experiences, and scientists wanted to study his changing brain, and politicians wanted to use his success for their own purposes. He ignored all of them and focused on what mattered, understanding Zyrith. And through her, understanding her entire species. Today was different from their usual meetings. And Kale could feel the tension in the air as soon as he entered the diplomatic chamber. Zyrith was already there. But she was not alone. Beside her floated 11 other shapes, each one as impossible and terrifying as she was. The pain hit Kale like a physical blow, and he staggered backward as his vision went white with agony. Blood poured from his nose and his ears, and he could feel something warm and wet running from the corners of his eyes. 12 Nethri. He realized through the haze of pain, 12 of them at once. This was not a meeting. This was a test. The others wish to see you, Zyrith said, her voice barely audible over the roaring in Kale's head. They have heard stories about the human who does not look away, and they did not believe those stories were true. Kale forced himself to stand straight, even though every muscle in his body was screaming at him to collapse. He opened his eyes even wider and looked at all 12 of them, letting the pain wash over him like a wave. I am honored to meet them, he managed to say. Though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper, one of the other Nethery moved forward, its form even more complex than Xyrith's. "How are you doing this?" it asked. And there was no kindness in its voice, only cold curiosity. "How is your mind surviving what should destroy it?" Kale thought about the question carefully before answering. "I do not know for certain," he admitted. "But I think it is because I have chosen to accept the pain instead of fighting against it." The Nethery tilted in a way that suggested confusion. "Explain," it demanded. "When other beings look at you, they try to make sense of what they are seeing," Kale said slowly. "They try to fit you into categories that their minds can understand. And when that fails, their minds break from the effort." He paused to wipe blood from his face. "But I do not try to understand you in that way. And I simply accept that you are something beyond my comprehension. And I let myself feel the pain of that without trying to make it stop." The Nethery were silent for a long moment, and Kale could feel them examining him in ways he could not perceive. "That should not work," another one said finally. "Acceptance does not protect neural tissue from dimensional stress." "Maybe not," Kale agreed, "but it does change the way the neural tissue responds to that stress." He thought about the doctor's reports, about the new pathways forming in his brain. "My mind is not fighting against you anymore, and it is adapting to you instead. And that adaptation is what is keeping me sane." Xyrith moved closer to him, positioning herself between Kale and the others in what might have been a protective gesture. "He speaks the truth," she said. "I have watched his neural patterns during our meetings, and his brain is restructuring itself in ways I have never seen before." "Impossible," one of the Nethery said. "Evolution does not happen this quickly, not even in species with high neuroplasticity." "It is not evolution," Xyrith replied. "It is something else. Something that seems to be unique to humans." She turned to look at Kale, and he felt a warmth in her gaze that had not been there 6 months ago. "They do not merely survive," she said softly. "They grow." The words hung in the air, and Kale suddenly understood something important. He was not special because he was stronger than other humans or smarter or braver. He was doing what humans had always done when faced with impossible challenges. He was adapting. His species had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways. And they had survived not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being the most adaptable. They could live in deserts and frozen wastelands and deep jungles and everything in between. They could eat almost anything and survive almost any injury and recover from almost any trauma. And when faced with something that should have been beyond them, they did not give up. They changed. Kale looked at the 12 Nethery before him and smiled despite the agony that was tearing through his skull. "My species is young," he said. "We have only been among the stars for a short time, and we do not have the wisdom of the elder races or the technology of the great civilizations." He stood a little taller, drawing strength from somewhere deep inside himself. "But we have something else, and we have the ability to become whatever we need to become in order to survive." He looked directly at Xyrith, ignoring the pain that the focus cost him. "You said that humans cannot handle your kind, and you were right. But you were also wrong." He paused and took a breath. "We cannot handle you the way we are now, but we can become something that can handle you. And that is what I have been doing since the day we met." The chamber was silent, except for the sound of Kale's ragged breathing. Then one of the Nethery spoke, and its voice was different from before, softer and almost gentle. "There is an old concept among our people," it said, "a myth that we told ourselves in the early days of our existence, when we first realized that other species could not bear to look upon us." The Nethery shifted and changed, and somehow the motion seemed almost sad. "We called it the one who sees, and it spoke of a being who could witness us fully and not break, who could look into the heart of what we are and choose to remain." Another pause. We believed it was only a story, a dream to comfort ourselves during the long years of loneliness. The Netheri moved closer to Kale, and he held his ground even as the pain increased. But you have made the story real, it said. You have become what we dreamed of, but never believed we would find. Kale felt tears mixing with the blood on his face, though he was not sure if they were from pain or emotion. I am just a human, he said. Just one man who was too stubborn to look away. No, Zareth said, and her voice was filled with something that might have been love. You are so much more than that. She reached out toward him with something that was almost a hand. You are the bridge that we have been waiting for. And you are the proof that connection is possible, even between beings as different as we are. Kale reached back toward her, his hand trembling but steady. Then let us build that bridge together, he said, and in that moment, surrounded by beings that should have driven him mad, Kale Vance felt more sane than he had ever felt in his life. The word spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The Netheri had accepted humanity as diplomatic partners after 3,000 years of isolation and fear. The beings that no one could look at had found someone willing to see them, the Galactic. Concord did not know how to react to this news. Some species were excited by the possibility of finally making contact with the Netheri through human intermediaries. Others were terrified that humanity had somehow allied themselves with the most dangerous beings in the universe, and a few were simply jealous that the youngest species in the Concord had accomplished something that all the elder races had failed to do. Chancellor Vareth called an emergency session of the Concord Council to discuss what this meant for galactic politics. Representatives from 100 different species gathered in the Great Hall on the Concord's capital station. The chamber was vast and circular, designed to accommodate beings of every shape and size. Vareth stood at the center, his crystalline body ringing with stress harmonics that echoed through the room. We must address the human situation, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall. Their ambassador has done what we all believed to be impossible, and we must decide how to respond. A representative from the Veleth Collective spoke first, her voice translated by the chamber systems into 100 different languages. The humans have taken a terrible risk, she said. They have exposed themselves to the Netheri, and we do not know what the long-term consequences will be. The consequences seem to be positive so far. Another representative argued, Ambassador Vance is not only surviving his contact with the Netheri, but thriving in ways we do not understand. That is precisely the problem, the Veleth representative replied. We do not understand what is happening to him, and things we do not understand are dangerous. The argument continued for hours, with species taking sides based on their own fears and hopes. Some wanted to quarantine humanity until they could be certain that Netheri exposure was not somehow contagious. Others wanted to use humanity as a bridge to finally establish relations with the Netheri. And still others wanted to simply wait and see what happened next on Earth. Kale Vance was dealing with his own set of problems. The changes in his brain had accelerated since his meeting with the 12 Netheri, and the doctors were becoming increasingly concerned. Your neural structure is unlike anything we have ever seen, the lead researcher told him. You have pathways in your brain that should not be able to exist. Connections that seem to operate on principles we do not understand. Kale listened to the report and nodded calmly. Am I in danger? He asked. We honestly do not know, the researcher admitted. By all of our models, you should have died months ago, but instead you seem to be healthier than ever. She pulled up a scan of his brain on the display. Look at this, she said, pointing to a cluster of new connections. These pathways did not exist 6 months ago, and they seem to be allowing you to process sensory information in ways that normal human brains cannot. Kale studied the image and felt a strange sense of peace. So I am becoming something new, he said quietly. You are becoming something that should not be possible, the researcher confirmed. And we have no idea what you will be when the transformation is complete. That night, Kale sat alone in his apartment and thought about everything that had happened since he first volunteered for the Nethri mission. He had known the risks when he signed up, and he had accepted them because he believed that someone needed to try, but he had never expected this. He had never expected to change so fundamentally that he was no longer quite human. A soft chime announced a visitor, and Kale knew who was before he even opened the door. His wife Sarah stood in the hallway, her eyes red from crying. I read the medical report, she said as she stepped inside. The one that says you might be transforming into something else. Kale nodded and took her hands in his. I know, he said, and I'm sorry that I did not tell you myself. Sarah pulled him into a tight hug, and he could feel her trembling against him. Are you still you? She asked in a small voice. Are you still the man I married? The man who held our daughter's hand when she died. Kale held her close and thought about the question. It was a good question. Maybe the most important question anyone had ever asked him. I am still me, he said finally. I remember everything that makes me who I am. Every moment with you and Emma, every joy and every sorrow. He pulled back so he could look into her eyes. The changes are real, and I will not pretend otherwise, but they are adding to who I am, not replacing it. Sarah searched his face for a long moment, looking for any sign that her husband was gone. The doctors say you might become something beyond human, she said. Does that frighten you? Kale smiled. And it was the same smile he had worn when he proposed to her 20 years ago. A little, he admitted. But it also excites me, because I am becoming someone who can truly connect with beings that have been alone for 3,000 years. He wiped a tear from Sarah's cheek. I am becoming a bridge, he said, and bridges are meant to connect things that were separated before. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed softly. You always were too stubborn for your own good, she said. It is what you love about me. Kale replied, among other things. Sarah agreed, and she kissed him gently. The next morning, Kale received a message from Xyrith. It was not transmitted through normal channels, but arrived directly in his mind. A wordless communication that he somehow understood perfectly. The Nethri were coming to Earth, not just Xyrith, but a full delegation of her people. They wanted to establish formal relations with humanity, and they wanted to do it in person. Kale knew what this meant, and he knew what it would require. The Nethri could not simply appear on Earth without preparation, because their presence would drive anyone who looked at them insane. But if Kale was right about what was happening to him, there might be a way to change that. He spent the next week working with Xyrith to develop a plan. The idea was simple in concept, but incredibly difficult in execution. Kale would serve as a focal point, a translator not of languages, but of existence itself. When the Nethri arrived, they would filter their presence through him, allowing him to soften their impact on human minds. It would be painful, possibly the most painful thing he had ever experienced, but it would also be necessary if the two species were ever going to meet face to face. The day of the delegation's arrival came, and Kale stood in the center of a specially prepared chamber at the United Nations. Headquarters cameras were broadcasting the event to every corner of the planet, though they had been warned that the feed might cut out if the Nethri proved too much for the equipment. Millions of people watched as Kale closed his eyes and reached out with his transformed mind. He felt Xyrith first, her familiar presence like a warm light in the darkness. Then he felt the others, 11 more Nethri joining their power to hers, and then they were there, manifesting in the chamber in all their terrible beauty. The cameras flickered and distorted, but they did not fail. The observers in the room gasped and stumbled. But they did not collapse because Kale was there, standing between the Netherry and humanity. His changed brain acting as a filter that made the impossible merely difficult. It hurt more than anything he had ever experienced, more than watching Emma die, more than all his months of exposure combined. But he held on because that was what he did. He held on because humanity needed him to hold on. And as the pain threatened to consume him, he felt something else. He felt hope. 1 year had passed since Cale Vance first met Xyrath, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Netherry delegation remained on Earth, conducting the first real diplomatic negotiations between their species and any other race in 3,000 years. It was slow work, complicated by the vast differences in how the two peoples experienced reality, but it was working. And that was more than anyone had ever believed possible. Cale's hair had turned completely white from the strain of serving as a bridge between the two species. His eyes had changed too, developing a strange shimmer that caught the light in unusual ways. The doctor said his brain had stabilized in its new configuration, settled into a form that was no longer quite human, but was definitely still Cale. He had become something new, something that had never existed before, a hybrid of human determination and Netherry perception. Able to exist in both worlds at once, the Vance Protocol, as it came to be known, was now being taught to diplomats around the world. It was a program designed to prepare human minds for contact with beings beyond their comprehension, not through drugs or technology, but through philosophy and meditation and what Cale called aggressive empathy. The results were remarkable. Within 6 months, a dozen other humans had developed the ability to interact with Netherry without losing their sanity. Within a year, that number had grown to over 100. Humanity was adapting. Just as Cale had always believed they could, the Galactic Concord watched these developments with a mixture of awe and fear. Chancellor Vorath requested a meeting with Cale. Traveling to Earth personally for the first time in his long tenure, they met in a garden outside the United Nations building, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in colors the universe had never seen. The flowers were a gift from the Netherry, organisms that existed partially in other dimensions and displayed beauty that normal plants could not achieve. "I must confess something," Vorath said as he looked at the impossible flowers. "When we first learned of your contact with the Netherry, I was certain it would end in disaster." Cale nodded and sat down on a bench nearby. "Many people thought the same thing," he said. "There were times when I thought it myself." Vorath's crystalline body chimed with a frequency that expressed something like shame. "We have been avoiding the Netherry for so long that we forgot why we started avoiding them in the first place," he said. "We forgot that it was not because they were dangerous, but because we were afraid." He turned to look at Cale with sensors that perceived far more than human eyes ever could. "You have shown us what we should have done 3,000 years ago, and I am not sure whether to thank you or resent you for it." Cale smiled, the expression softened by the strange shimmer in his eyes. "Thank me," he said. "Resentment is not a useful emotion, and there is too much work to be done for any of us to waste time on regret." Vorath considered this and then nodded slowly. "You are wise for such a young species," he said. "Perhaps that is why you succeeded where we failed." Before Cale could respond, the air beside them shimmered and Xyrath appeared. She had learned to manifest in ways that were less overwhelming to other beings. Though she was still impossible and beautiful and terrible, all at once Cale looked at her without flinching, and the love in his eyes was visible to anyone who cared to see it. Not romantic love, but something deeper and stranger. The love of someone who had seen another being truly and completely, had accepted them for everything they were, and had chosen to stay. "The others are ready," Xyrath said, a voice like music from an instrument that had never been built. "Ready for what?" Vorath asked. Xyrath turned to look at the Chancellor, and even in her softened form, he had to look away. ready to end our isolation, she said, ready to rejoin the galaxy that forgot us, and to share the things we have learned during our 3,000 years alone. Voreth's crystalline body rang with surprise and hope. You would share your knowledge with the Concord, he asked. We would share everything. Zyrith confirmed. Our science and our art and our understanding of the universe. And all we ask in return is that you stop being afraid of us. She looked at Kale, and something passed between them that no words could capture. This human taught us that connection is possible, even between beings as different as we are. And if it is possible with humans, then it is possible with everyone. Kale stood up and walked to stand beside Zyrith. The impossible angles of her form no longer caused him pain, and he could see the beauty in her that had always been there. I used to think that my job was to help humanity understand the Netherry, he said, but I was wrong about that. He looked at Voreth and then at Zyrith and then out at the garden full of impossible flowers. My job was to show everyone that understanding is possible, he continued, to prove that the things that seem impossible are only impossible until someone decides to try. He reached out and touched Zyrith's form, his hand passing through dimensions that human hands were never meant to reach. She warned me that humans could not handle her kind, he said softly, and she was right. But she was also wrong. He smiled, and there was no pain in the expression anymore. We could not handle them as we were. But we are not what we were, and we never have to be. Zyrith moved closer to him, her impossible geometry folding around him like an embrace. He never looked away, she said to Voreth. In all the universe, across all the species we have encountered, he was the first to simply stay. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice held 3,000 years of loneliness finally coming to an end. Not because he was unafraid, she said, but because he decided the fear was worth enduring. Voreth watched them standing together, the human and the Netherry, the bridge and the beings it connected, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Chancellor of the Galactic Concord felt hope for the future, not because the universe had become less strange or less dangerous, but because one stubborn human had proven that courage and love could overcome any barrier, even the barrier between what was possible and what was not later that day. Kale stood at the window of his apartment and looked out at the city below. Sarah stood beside him, her hand in his, her head resting on his shoulder. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Kale thought about everything he had lost and everything he had gained. He thought about Emma, gone too soon but never forgotten. He thought about the pain he had endured and the changes he had undergone. He thought about the future. That was now possible because he had refused to look away. No, he said finally. I do not regret a single moment. Sarah squeezed his hand and smiled. Good, she said, because I think you still have a lot of work to do. Kale laughed, and the sound was filled with joy. I think you are right, he agreed. But that is okay, because I have always liked having something to work toward. He looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening blue somewhere out there. The Netherry were waiting to share their gifts with a galaxy that had feared them for far too long, and somewhere inside himself, Kale Vance knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history, the beginning of an age of connection and understanding, the beginning of something beautiful, and all because one man had decided not to look away the end.